Hi everyone, it's Miss Costa here, and in this video I'm going to be going through multiplication with surds. Okay, so here I've got my first question. I'm being asked to evaluate these two surds. Now, evaluate literally just means work out the value. Okay, so it's one of those things that you have to know the exam lingo. Evaluate just means work out the value of. And all a surd is basically something written in a square root that can't be simplified. So for instance, the square root of 25, we all know can be written as 5. Okay, but the square root of 3, that's an irrational number. It means that if I typed it into my calculator, I'd get like this long decimal with loads of numbers after the decimal point. So a surd is something that can't be simplified past what it's written as here. So I'm being asked to evaluate the square root of 3 times the square root of 7. Now, just like in algebra, where I can, if I'm multiplying terms, let's say I've got a times b, I can write them as ab. I can do that with surds as well when I'm multiplying them. So the square root of 3 multiplied by the square root of 7 could become the square root of 3 times by 7. Now, what is the square root of 3 times 7 is 21. So I'd just write that as the square root of 21. So when I'm multiplying surds, I can bring them together under like the umbrella of one square root and then just express it as those two numbers multiplied. So let's try another one. I've got the square root of 2 times by the square root of 3. Again, I can bring them together. So write it as the square root of 2 times by 3, which equals the square root of 6. And that's all I'm doing. I'm working out the value. Now it says evaluate. If it was a calculator paper, you could write it in its decimal form. If it's a non-calculator paper, it's absolutely fine to leave it like this. For the next question, we've got the square root of 4 squared. Now this is important because this is where you can see how when we manipulate surds, what starts to happen. So when something is squared, what does that mean? It means it's being multiplied by itself. So I can write that as the square root of 4 times by the square root of 4. And what would that become? Well, the square root of 4 times by 4 would become the square root of 16. And the square root of 16, now this is another really important point. When you're dealing with surds, it's really important you know your square numbers up to 15 and can recognise them. So 1, 4, 9, 16, so forth. So the square root of 16 is 4. And that's how I'd evaluate that. So I'd work out the value. So when you're dealing with surds, what you ideally want to get to is a number that you can square root. So we know the square root of 16 is 4. And we can just write it as its true value. So that's how I do a question like that. And then next, we've got something that looks like this. So both of these values are surds. And I need to evaluate them. So once again, write them under one umbrella. So the square root of 5 times by 8, I can write them under 1, which becomes the square root of 40. Now, what I want to do is, in the first two examples, I couldn't simplify that surd any further. So the square root of 21 and the square root of 6, I can't simplify it any further. However, the square root of 40, I can. So what I want to do is write out my square numbers. So I've got 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, 49, 64, and so forth. That will do for now, but obviously all of them. So what I want to do to simplify this is find a square number that fits into 40. So hopefully you can see that over here I could do 4 times by 10. Okay, so I could express that. All I'm doing is expressing it in a different way. So 5 times 8 is 40. 40 is obviously 40. And 4 times 10 gets you 40. So this is the same thing expressed in 3 different ways. Now, the reason I want to express it like this is because then I could write that as the square root of 4 times by the square root of 10. So you can do this interchangeably. You could write it under one square root, or you can manipulate it into 2 square roots, whichever works best for what you're trying to do. Now, the reason I want to get a square number is because I know that the square root of 4 is 2. So I could write that as 2 times the square root of 10. Now the square root of 10 I can't simplify any further. And if this is getting a little bit tricky, then watch the video on simplifying surds, because that's important. But for now, I'm going to assume that you know how to simplify. So 2 times the square root of 10. I can't simplify the square root of 10 any further. Why not? Well, what are the factors of 10? How could I write that? I could write that as 2 times 5 or 10 times 1. None of them are square numbers, so I've simplified it as far as I can. So anyway, what do I do if in algebra I had 2 times a? I would just write it as 2a. So therefore 2 times the square root of 10 can be written as 2 square root of 10. Okay, so that's how I'd do that question. And again, a similar one. So the square root of 8 times the square root of 4. Now, there are a few ways we could do this. I'll show you 2 ways. So first way, I could recognise that this is already a number that I can square root. So I could write it as the square root of 8 times by 2. And then deal with the square root of 8 and simplify that surd. So the square root of 8, how could I write it? Remember, I'm trying to look for square numbers. So 1, 4, 9, 16. Obviously, 1 would never really do anything because it wouldn't help me in any way. But I know that I could write the square root of 8 as 4 times by the square root of 2. Okay, so the square root of 8 can be written as 4 times 2, because 4 times 2 makes 8, and that can be written separately as square root of 4 times square root of 2. What's the square root of 4? Well, I know the square root of 4 is 2, so I could write that as 2 times square root of 2, which is just 2 root 2. So I could replace the square root of 8 with 2 root 2, and I'm timesing that by 2. Now, when I am multiplying surds, each part of it, just like if I had in algebra, if I had 2a, I know that that means 2 times a. When I have 2 root 2, that means 2 times by root 2. So over here, I could write that as 2 times by root 2 times by 2. Simplify it by doing 2 times 2, which is 4. And then I'm left with 4 times root 2, which would simplify to 4 root 2. So that's just a little bit of a whistle-stop tour of the first few. It does get a little bit trickier because you are simplifying as well. So if the simplifying part is tripping you up, then watch the video on simplifying surds. And if not, then have a go at these questions. So just pause the video and have a go, and let's see how we get on. Okay, so let's see how we got on. So for the first one, root 7 times by root 5 would end up being root 35. And once again, I don't know why it's made it really thick. So root 35, I can't simplify that any further because the factors of 35 are 35 times by 1 and 7 times 5. And 7 and 5 are prime numbers, so I'm not going to get any square root in there. Next, I've got 13 times root 2, which would become the square root of 26. Remember, you bring surds together, you're just multiplying them. Then I've got square root of 3 squared. So square root of 3 times square root of 3 would become the square root of 9, which is 3. Now, this is also a really important thing to bear in note. If you've got a surd squared, it becomes itself. So like in this case, square root of 3 times square root of 3, the answer is just 3. If it was root 7 squared, the answer would be 7, and so forth. So that's a little trick that hopefully you remember. Over here then I've got I'd have the square root of 50. Now I'm looking for square numbers, remember, so let's just write the square numbers up again. So you got 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, 49. Do any of these fit into 50? Yes, 25 does. So I could write that as 25 times by 2, which I could write as the square root of 25 times the square root of 2. And the square root of 25 is 5. So that would become 5 root 2. 5 root 2. Then I've got the square root of 9 times by root 8. So I could do that as either 3 root 8 and then simplify the root 8, or I'll show you the other way. You could just do that as root 72. Now let's look for square numbers that fit into 72. Well, I know that 36 times by 2 gives me 72, which I could write as root 36 times by root 2, which is 6 root 2. So hopefully you got those all right. If not, drop a comment below and I'll explain it in a different way and let me know which one you struggled with. Okay, so now we're moving on to slightly trickier ones. The only reason they're a little bit trickier is because they've got, each third has its own coefficient, so its own little number in front of it. So just like with algebra, where if I had 2a times by 3b, I could write that as 2 times a times 3 times b, and then write that as 6ab. I'm going to do a similar thing with my third. So I could write that as 2 times root 3 times by 3 times root 7. So everything is being multiplied, so I can multiply the 2 by the 3, which is 6, and root 3 times root 7, I could write as root 21, because 3 times 7 is 21. And just like with algebra, I wouldn't write 6 times a, I would write 6a. So here I'm not going to write 6 times 21, I'm going to write 6 root 21. Now, this is a simple one. I don't have to simplify this any further, but if I did, I would break that down further, and there will be an example of that next. So 6 root 21. Okay, now let's do a similar thing. So I'm going to break that down into 3 times root 3 times by 2 times by root 8. So 3 times 2 gives me 6, and 3 times 8 is 24, so that would be 6 times root 24. Now let's look at the square numbers. So we've got 4, 9, 16, 25. Do any of these fit into 24? Yes. 4. So the easiest way to break down thirds is by looking for a square number that fits into it. So I'd have 6 times 4 times by 6 gives me 24. So I could break that into 6 times root 4 times root 6. And what's root 4? Root 4 is 2. The square root of 4 is 2. So I'd break it down like that. 6 times 2 is 12. So I'd have 12 root 6. Now, the more you do thirds, the more you're going to recognise which ones are thirds and which ones might have a square root. So square root of 6 is a third. You can't simplify it any further. So if you ever end up with root 6, you know you've finished. You can't simplify it. And last question. Over here, we've got 4 times by the root 3 times by 3 times by root 8. So once again, 4 times 3 is 12 and 3 times 8 is 24. So we've got 12 times by, and this is the same as what we did last time. I know that 24, I had to have 4, 9, 16, 25. I know that 4 fits into 24, so 4 times 6. Which I could write as 12 times root 4 times root 6. And root 4 is just 2. The square root of 4 is 2. So 12 times 2 times root 6 becomes 24 root 6. So hopefully that made sense. And now here you can have a go at these practice questions. So pause the video, have a go at them, and then let's see if you got them correct. Okay, so for the first one, I've got 2 times root 7 times 3 times root 5, which would become 2 times 3 is 6, root 35. You can't simplify 35 any further, so that's how we'd leave that. Then you'd have 2 times root 13 times 5 times root 2. 2 times 5 is 10. 13 times 2 is 26. Then over here, we've got root 3 times root 3 times root 3. Remember, cubed means multiplied by itself 3 times. So 3 times 3 is 9 times 3 is 27. So how could we write that using our square numbers? Well, we've got 4. Let's write the square numbers out quickly. 4, 9, 16, 25, 36. And does anything fit into 27? Yes, 9. So I could write that as root 9 times root 3, which would be 3 root 3. Another way of thinking about it is if it's cubed, it's going to be its unsurd self, so like this number to the root of 3, because it's going to be the square times by that value again. But you don't have to remember that, you just have to know how to work that out yourselves. Then we've got 6 times root 5, so 6 times root 5 times 2 times root 10. 6 times 2 is 12. 5 times 10 is 50. So once again, let's see if we can break that down. That would become, so 25 times by 2 gives me 50. So I could write that as 12 times root 25 times root 2, which is 12 times 5 times root 2, because square root of 25 is 5. 12 times 5 is 60, so I'd be left with 60 root 2. And for the final one, I've got 2 times root 9 times by 3 times root 8. So that would become 2 times 3 is 6 times by root 72. And 72, does any square number fit into 72? Yes, 36 does. So that would become 6 times by root 2 times by root 36, which is 6 times root 2 times by 6. And 6 times 6 is just 36. So that would become 36 root 2 for that one. So hopefully that that made sense. This is the first part of multiplying surds. Next video is multiplying with single brackets. And if this is still a little bit unsure, then watch the video on simplifying surds. And any comments, just let me know.